What's up? It's the Tominator. And in light of that Sean Ray versus Dexter Jackson comparison video I did a couple weeks ago, it's become painfully obvious that a lot of you guys really still don't understand bodybuilding or the way these shows are actually judged. Now, to be fair, that's mostly the fault of the the IFBB Pro League, and the piece of crap judging system that they continue to rely on because it tells us absolutely nothing about how or why they arrive at their decisions. So, in the wake of these big events, us fans are left to sort of speculate and play detective, following the clues and trying to piece together the puzzle after the fact. But anyway, I'm not going to dive into all that again since I've already covered this topic extensively in previous vids. But yeah, reading through your comments, many of you seem to be suggesting that Ray would beat Dexter simply because he was more aesthetic, or because he was the better poser, or had a nicer looking midsection, etc. Essentially, it's the old who would you rather look like argument that Arnold helped popularize a few years ago. And it's a compelling point, don't get me wrong. I wish the judges would factor in aesthetics and artistic presentation more than they do. Bodybuilding would almost certainly be in a better state today if they did. But the reality is, that's just not how they operate. After watching and reviewing these contests for years now, it's become quite apparent to me that the judges really only care about a couple things. First and foremost, mass and conditioning. This is like their holy grail that they covet above all else. And to a lesser extent, stuff like symmetry, proportions, and complete development also play a role. Posing is only relevant when it becomes so bad it starts to detract from an otherwise stellar physique. And aesthetics, let's be honest, aesthetics don't count for jack shit. Perhaps the best reason I can think of to sum it up is that aesthetics are largely subjective, whereas mass and conditioning are objective. That makes the latter better criteria for impartial comparison. And this idea comes from one of my long term subscribers, Lucian Papa, so I'm not going to take credit for it, but I think it's a very insightful observation and one that we should all take a moment to consider. I mean, think about it. Who's more aesthetic, Frank Zane or Bob Paris? Lee Haney or Lee Labrada? Kevin Levrone or Sean Ray? Jay Cutler or Ronnie Coleman? Opinions will vary, and there's no right or wrong answer here because, as they say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But if we observe these competitors standing side by side as they go through the quarter turns and the mandatories, we should more or less be able to agree on who has the greater level of muscularity and conditioning. So that's the first major point to take away. The second major point is that aesthetics can make you look great individually, but they don't help that much in a call-out line. There's been plenty of bodybuilders throughout history who look absolutely amazing in their own right. When you see them doing their posing routines, you just think, damn man, that guy looks perfect, he should win the show. But then you plunk them in a lineup of bigger guys and they get dwarfed or completely out-muscled up there. Sean Ray, Lee Priest, Muhammad Makawe, Thierry Pastel, Francis Benfato, Melvin Anthony, all these guys look like Mr. Olympia standing on their own. But not so much when you put them beside a Lee Haney, Dorian Yates, or Ronnie Coleman. And since contests are won and lost through comparisons and not individual routines, a point that can't be stressed enough, this usually doesn't bode well for the smaller or less conditioned guys. Things like mass, width, structure, and density matter a lot because at the end of the day, bodybuilding is a muscle contest, not a beauty pageant. As much as people continue to draw that analogy and might like to think so, it's not about building the most beautiful body. Not really. So while us hardcore fans who have a more acquired taste, let's just say, might be able to appreciate the aesthetic quality of 250 plus pounds of rock solid muscle, if you go ask the average person what they think of it, most of them will tell you they find it disgusting. They'll say it's too much, it's too freaky. Even Arnold, in contest form, would be considered over the top and not attractive to the vast majority of women. Let's be real here. Most chicks would rather fuck a guy who looks like Chris Hemsworth or Brad Pitt back in the day than someone like Schwarzenegger or Flex Wheeler. It's no secret that bodybuilding has never been appealing to the mainstream, and it probably never will be. It really is more of an acquired taste, and that's why I think it will always remain rather niche. Shows at the pro level and the Mr. Olympia competition in particular are won by the biggest man with the best conditioning, 9 times out of 10. You can go way back, and this rule still applies. Was Arnold winning all those titles because he was so aesthetic and had the body we all dreamed of? Or was it simply because he was the biggest, most ripped guy for his time? Did they truly value aesthetics and symmetry more in the 80s and 90s? Or was it more just that the guys back then competed at lower body weights, where maintaining a streamlined midsection was still universally feasible? See, I would argue that whatever aesthetic merits these old school bodybuilders happen to possess, it was mainly coincidental, more of a nice bonus than an essential feature. Because again, just pick a champion, pick a year, and ask yourself, was he the most aesthetic physique on stage that day? For instance, was Arnold so much more aesthetic than Serge Nubret in 1973? Was Lee Haney more aesthetic than Lee Labrada in 1990? Was Dorian Yates more appealing than Sean Ray in 94? Or how about Ronnie Coleman versus Flex Wheeler in 99? In each of these cases, especially the last two, I would argue that the champion was decidedly less aesthetic than the runner up, especially when just standing there relaxed, awaiting that final announcement. Now, to be fair, there is the odd time where the reverse is true. The most recent example was Sean Roden defeating Phil Heath in 2018. But even then, I would argue that aesthetics had little effect on the outcome. Sure, Sean might have owned him in the ab and thigh, but so what? He'd been beating Phil in that pose for years, dating back to at least 2014, and it never mattered before. The only reason Roden won was because he was now equally as conditioned as Phil, and Phil came in with a bloated bubble gut 2 years in a row. It had less to do with aesthetics and more to do with the judges sending a message after all the backlash on social media the previous year. We saw the same thing play out a decade earlier with Dexter Jackson upsetting Jay Cutler in 2008. Dexter was easily the more aesthetic bodybuilder, but he won because of greater conditioning, not because he had the prettier physique. And again, I think the judges were sending a message after most of the community felt Victor Martinez got robbed in '07 when Cutler came in off. So this was the second year in a row Jay missed the mark, and that's why he lost. It had nothing to do with aesthetics. And this was quite convincingly confirmed in 2009 when a much drier and improved Jay Cutler immediately reclaimed the title. Of course, the other element to consider in all this is posing and presentation, since polished posing goes a long way to showcasing the physique in an artistic and elegant manner. Surely that should count for something and give many of these smaller guys an edge, right? Well, you'd think so, but no. That's not how they judge it at all if history is anything to go by. Here's the scorecard from 2001, one of the oldest that's readily available online. And you can note that Ronnie was somehow winning the posing round. That third column there represents the posing round, aka the individual routines. And for those of you who don't already know, it's like golf where the lower the number, the better. Now, I invite you to look up some of the posing routines for each of these top guys. I think you can find them all on YouTube still. And tell me, in what world was Ronnie's goofy ass posing performance better than Kevin's or Sean's? The only possible explanation is that they don't give a damn about a well crafted and graceful presentation, but score it the same way they would for any other round, where the biggest, most shredded guys get the nod. So that's really the nail in the coffin for me when it comes to this debate. Hell, they don't even score the posing round anymore, which is telling, at least not at the Olympia. But even when they did, they never really cared about the posing itself. So it's a total newbie mistake to read too much into posing routines since they don't actually count towards the scoring, and the so-called posing round was a sham to begin with. But even when it comes to the mandatory poses, how many of them really favor aesthetic physiques? Maybe you could argue the ab and thigh and front double biceps, but it's relatively easy to hide or downplay a blocky midsection in most of the rest. That's not to say these other poses can't be aesthetic. Of course, there's been countless examples of classic looking side triceps and front lat spreads, and even side chests in most musculars. But in head to head comparison, mass monsters have the advantage. For example, Lee Haney is typically going to lose to Dorian in the front lat spread, despite the former having a much smaller waist and fuller chest, because Yates was simply bigger and had the better legs. Dorian's also going to whoop more aesthetic guys like Flex or Sean in the side triceps because of his greater thickness and density. Even in the ab and thigh, a total knockout shot for Sean Ray. Yates is going to push and arguably beat him there too because of his bigger quads and better upper body taper. Like it or not, size really does matter, guys. Because so long as the conditioning is on point and the proportions are in check, bigger bodybuilders will always have the edge. Maybe if they mandated certain shots with a higher difficulty curve, like the hands overhead vacuum, or the crucifix, or that Bob Paris kneeling pose, maybe then aesthetics would be more heavily rewarded. But as it is, the current selection of mandatory poses just doesn't place enough emphasis on it. So, yeah, guys, hopefully that explains why aesthetics don't count for much in bodybuilding, at least not as far as winning professional competitions is concerned. I'm not saying I agree because I do and I don't. I certainly believe that criteria like mass and conditioning are more inherently objective than, say, aesthetics or posing. But at the same time, I think it would be better if they took these things into account a little more too. For starters, they could actually start scoring the posing round based on, actual posing ability. Call me crazy, but I think that might make sense. But anyway, that's all for this one. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and feel free to drop a like and subscribe for more bodybuilding commentary and analysis. But until next time, this has been the Tominator signing off, and I'll be back.